We succeeded by cutting out the useless employees who held us back, Jason declared from the stage, his voice booming through the conference hall with the smug confidence of a king addressing his court. The crowd, a mix of investors, board members, and industry journalists, erupted in applause. Cameras flashed around him, capturing the moment for the morning business news. His smile was a brilliant, predatory thing, all white teeth and hollow charm. I sat frozen at table 12, a glass of untouched Chardonnay sweating in my hand. Useless. Dead weight.
He was talking about me.
This grand launch event, meant to celebrate the future of Viper Point Dynamics, had just transformed into my public execution. Each clap from the audience felt like a stone being thrown, each camera flash a searing brand against my skin. I watched our biggest launch event transform into my public execution. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 14 years of meticulously keeping this company not just compliant but profitable, after dedicating my life to ensuring its stability and integrity, I was being branded as an obstacle that had been cleared. 14 years of long nights, of poring over spreadsheets until my eyes blurred, of navigating complex regulatory landscapes to keep us safe. All of it erased by a charismatic sociopath in a $1,000 suit. My name is Denise Holloway, and I'm 52 years old. Until this morning, I was the chief financial officer at Viper Point Dynamics, a mid-sized manufacturing company based in Portland, Oregon. I wasn't just an employee. I was part of the company's bedrock. I had been hired by the founder, old Mr. Abernathy, a man of quiet dignity and unshakable principles. The numbers tell a story, Denise. He'd told me on my first day, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Make sure they always tell the truth. For over a decade, I had honored that promise. While others chased headlines and glory, I worked behind the scenes. I was the quiet guardian of the company's health, the woman who ensured our books were clean, our partnership solid, and our compliance flawless. I wasn't the type to give flashy presentations or schmooze at networking events. That wasn't my world. My world was one of ledgers and law, of contracts and compliance. I was the woman who made sure the numbers added up and the legal documents were bulletproof. But apparently, that wasn't enough for Jason Wexler, our new CEO, who had swooped in 6 months ago with a whirlwind of promises about modernization and aggressive growth. The board, eager for a stock price injection, had been completely seduced by his slick presentations and talk of disruptive innovation. From day one, he made it clear that my methodical, cautious approach didn't align with his vision of a dynamic, forward-thinking organization. What he really meant was that he wanted yes-men who would rubber-stamp his reckless expansion plans, not a seasoned CFO who asked uncomfortable questions about inflated projections and questionable vendor agreements. As I watched Jason bask in the spotlight, describing our latest product line as revolutionary, I couldn't help but think about the unsigned audit report sitting in my office safe. It was the one that detailed discrepancies I had discovered just last week, the one I had refused to certify until we addressed the irregularities. Jason had brushed off my concerns with a condescending pat on the arm. Denise, he'd purred, his voice a low, dismissive hum. We can clean up the details later. Focus on the big picture. But I knew better. I had spent my entire career building a reputation for integrity, and I wasn't about to compromise it now. That refusal had cost me my job. He had called me into his office this morning, just hours before the event. The same characteristic smirk was plastered on his face as he delivered the news. Your services are no longer required, Denise. We're going in a different direction. He had timed my termination perfectly, right before our biggest event, ensuring maximum humiliation. The audience hung on Jason's every word as he painted a picture of unprecedented success and limitless potential. Investors nodded approvingly, their checkbooks practically visible in their eyes. I noticed several board members scattered throughout the crowd, including the chairman, Robert Hayes, all wearing satisfied, sycophantic smiles. They had no idea what was really happening behind the scenes. They had no idea what was about to happen now. Suddenly, 2 large men in dark suits detached themselves from the wall near the back of the ballroom. Security. They began moving through the crowd, their destination obvious. Their eyes were fixed on me. I had expected this moment. I had been anticipating it ever since Jason had called me into his office that morning. But as the guards approached my table, a cold calm settled over me. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored black suit, and reached for the black folder I had prepared. Something told me this evening wasn't going to unfold exactly as Jason had planned. Looking back, I should have seen the writing on the wall months earlier. Jason had arrived at Viper Point Dynamics with great fanfare, recruited by our board after Mr. Abernathy's chosen successor announced his retirement. The industry publications had heralded him as a visionary leader, a turnaround artist who had transformed his previous company from a regional player into a national powerhouse. I did my research, of course. It was my job to be thorough. Late one night, fueled by coffee and a gnawing sense of unease, I dug into his past. What the glowing articles failed to mention was that he had left that company just before a federal investigation into accounting irregularities was launched. The investigation had fizzled out, with Jason conveniently gone, but the whispers remained online if you knew where to look. I brought my concerns to the board chairman, Robert Hayes, in a private meeting. I laid out the articles, the timelines, the suspicious timing of Jason's departure. Robert simply waved a dismissive hand. "Denise, that's just the cost of doing business at that level. Jason brings exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve extraordinary results." His condescension was thick enough to taste. It was then I realized I was truly alone. The board hadn't been duped. They were complicit. They wanted the stock to soar, and they didn't care how Jason made it happen. Those calculated risks had started almost immediately. Jason began pushing for aggressive revenue targets that seemed divorced from reality. He wanted to expand into new markets without proper research, sign contracts with vendors I had never properly vetted, and pursue partnerships that made my compliance instincts scream. Every time I raised a question in a meeting, he would smile that condescending smile and tell me I was being unnecessarily cautious, a relic of an older, slower way of doing business. The other executives, eager to curry favor with their new leader, would nod in agreement, leaving me isolated. My assistant, Catherine, a sharp young woman I'd mentored for years, had noticed the change. "Is everything okay, Denise?" she'd ask, her brow furrowed with concern as she saw the stacks of files I was taking home each night. Catherine had been with the company for 8 years and knew me well enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong. "Just being extra careful," I had told her, which was both true and a massive understatement. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago, during our monthly executive meeting. Jason had presented a proposal to backdate several large vendor agreements to inflate our quarterly numbers and meet his impossible targets. The room had gone silent as he outlined his plan. All eyes eventually turned to me. I had looked him straight in the eye and said, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest, "I cannot and will not sign off on any documentation that misrepresents our financial position. Jason, this is fraud." His mask had slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold, ruthless calculation beneath his charming exterior. "Denise," he'd said, his voice dropping to a low threat, "I'm asking you to be a team player." "Then I guess we have a problem," I replied, standing up and gathering my documents. That conversation had sealed my fate, but it had also crystallized my resolve. That night, I had gone home and begun documenting everything. Every questionable decision, every inappropriate request, every corner Jason had tried to get me to cut. I had photographed emails, copied files, and created a comprehensive record of his attempts to manipulate our financial reporting. Catherine, whose loyalty was to the principles we had upheld for years, became my silent partner. She would subtly leave crucial files on my desk or ensure I had access to server logs I was suddenly being locked out of. Call it professional paranoia or simply good sense, but I had learned long ago that when integrity was at stake, documentation was your best defense. The final, damning piece of evidence came the week before the launch event, hidden in a routine audit report that should have been straightforward. I had been reviewing our third quarter financials when I noticed discrepancies in several key accounts. There were revenue numbers that didn't match our actual sales records, expenses that had been mysteriously reclassified, and vendor payments that corresponded to contracts I had never seen. I spent the entire weekend in my office, cross-referencing documents and following paper trails. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Jason hadn't just been pushing aggressive accounting practices, he had been actively falsifying records. Revenue had been inflated by nearly 15% through a combination of backdated contracts and fictitious sales. Expenses had been manipulated to create the appearance of improved margins. Even our cash flow statements had been doctored. It was a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies. The audit firm we had been working with for years, McKenna and Associates, had already begun their preliminary review. I knew their senior partner, David McKenna, personally, and I trusted his integrity. When I called him Sunday evening to discuss my findings, his voice grew grave. "Denise, these numbers don't match what we've been provided," he said after I walked him through my discoveries. "If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at systematic fraud." "That's exactly what we're looking at," I replied. "The question is, what do we do about it?" David was quiet for a long moment. "We need to halt the audit immediately until these discrepancies can be resolved. I cannot sign off on financial statements that I know to be fraudulent." That was the last piece I needed. On Monday morning, I requested an emergency meeting with Jason. I walked into his office with a copy of the preliminary audit findings and my own documentation of the irregularities. His reaction was not what I had expected. Instead of denial or even anger, Jason had leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Denise, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. These are simply different ways of presenting the same information. Nothing we're doing is technically illegal." "Jason, this is fraud," I said, placing the documents on his desk. "We cannot present these numbers to investors or the board. I won't sign off on them." His smile never wavered. "Then perhaps it's time we discussed your future with this company." The threat was clear, but I held my ground. "Are you asking me to certify false financial statements?" "I'm asking you to be a team player," he'd replied, the veneer of politeness wearing thin. I stood up and gathered my documents. "Then I guess we have a problem." That conversation had sealed my fate, but it had also crystallized my resolve. Jason could fire me, humiliate me, even try to destroy my reputation, but he could not force me to compromise my integrity. As I prepared for what I knew would be my final week at Viper Point Dynamics, I made sure every piece of evidence was carefully preserved and organized. If Jason wanted to play hardball, I would be ready. The launch event would be the perfect stage for the truth to finally come to light. The evening of the launch event arrived with all the pomp and circumstance Jason had envisioned. The ballroom at the Everhard Hotel was decorated with Viper Point's corporate colors, and servers circulated with expensive wine and catered appetizers. Industry journalists mingled with potential investors, board members, and key clients. It was exactly the kind of high-profile gathering where Jason thrived. I arrived fashionably late, wearing my best black suit and carrying the folder that would change everything. Catherine had offered to attend with me for moral support, but I had declined. This was something I needed to do alone. As I entered the ballroom, I caught sight of Jason near the stage, surrounded by admirers and holding court like the consummate showman he was. The presentation began at 7 p.m. sharp. Jason took the stage with practiced confidence, his smile bright enough to power the entire hotel. He spoke passionately about innovation, market disruption, and Viper Point's bright future. The audience was captivated, hanging on his every word as he painted a picture of unprecedented growth and profitability. "Our third quarter results exceeded all expectations," he declared, gesturing toward the large screen displaying our supposedly stellar financial performance. "Revenue is up 18% year over year, and our profit margins have improved significantly, thanks to strategic operational improvements." I felt my stomach tighten as I watched him present the fraudulent numbers with such conviction. Several investors in the audience were nodding approvingly, clearly impressed by what they perceived as outstanding financial health. Board Chairman Robert Hayes beamed from his front row seat, obviously pleased with his choice of CEO. Jason continued his presentation, outlining ambitious expansion plans and projected growth targets that were based entirely on the falsified financial foundation he had constructed. "We're not just growing," he proclaimed. "We're revolutionizing how this industry thinks about efficiency and profitability." Then came the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Jason's expression grew serious as he prepared to address what he called necessary organizational changes. "Success requires difficult decisions," he began, his voice taking on a more somber tone. "To achieve the results you see today, we had to eliminate inefficiencies and remove obstacles to progress. Sometimes that means parting ways with employees who are resistant to change or unable to adapt to new methodologies." The audience listened intently, clearly buying into his narrative of tough, but necessary leadership decisions. I could see several investors nodding in understanding, accepting the premise that successful companies sometimes had to make hard choices about personnel. "We succeeded by cutting out the useless employees who held us back," Jason declared with renewed energy, his smile returning. The crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause, and I felt the weight of every eye in the room. Some attendees knew exactly who he was referring to, and I could feel their gazes burning into me. The security guards began moving through the crowd, their destination unmistakably my table. Jason had orchestrated this moment perfectly. Public humiliation followed by physical removal, all in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to our industry. It was a masterclass in character assassination. But as the guards approached, I stood up calmly and began walking toward the stage. The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something unexpected was happening. Jason's smile faltered slightly as he noticed my movement, but he quickly recovered, probably assuming I was about to make some kind of desperate plea or emotional outburst. I climbed the steps to the stage with measured composure, my black folder clutched firmly in my hands. The ballroom had fallen completely silent, hundreds of eyes focused on the unfolding drama. Jason maintained his confident demeanor, extending his hand as if to shake mine in some gracious gesture of farewell. Instead, I handed him the folder. "Congratulations on your success, Jason," I said clearly, my voice carrying throughout the silent room. My tone was perfectly cordial, even warm, which seemed to catch him off guard. Without another word, I turned and walked off the stage, through the crowd, and out of the ballroom. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of confused voices as Jason opened the folder that would destroy everything he had built. The folder contained everything. 14 pages of meticulously documented evidence that would unravel Jason's carefully constructed web of deception. As I drove home through the Portland streets, I imagined him opening that black cover and seeing the first page, a cover letter from McKenna and Associates, stating their refusal to certify our financial statements, pending resolution of significant irregularities in reported revenue and expense allocations. The second section contained printouts of the original sales records alongside the doctored versions Jason had submitted for the quarterly reports, side-by-side comparisons that made the inflation impossible to deny. There was revenue that had been artificially boosted through backdated contracts with vendors who had confirmed in writing that they had never agreed to the terms being reported. Page 7 detailed the expense reclassifications that had been used to improve our apparent profit margins, legitimate operational costs that had been moved to different categories or written off entirely to create the illusion of efficiency improvements. Every manipulation was highlighted and cross-referenced with the original documentation. The most damaging section came toward the end: email printouts. Jason's own words, demanding that accounting staff find creative solutions to revenue shortfalls and instructing department heads to think outside the box when it came to expense reporting. His digital trail of pressure and intimidation, preserved in black and white. The final pages contained statements from 3 key vendors who had been contacted by Jason's team about backdating agreements. All 3 had refused and provided written documentation of those requests. One had even indicated that they were considering ending their relationship with ViperPoint due to what they perceived as unethical business practices. By the time I reached my house in the suburbs, my phone was already ringing. Catherine's number appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Then Robert Hayes called, followed by two board members I recognized. Each call went unanswered as I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my living room, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just transpired. The evening news was already running a story about disruption at a major Portland manufacturing company's launch event. While they didn't have details, they reported that several high-profile investors left abruptly following an unexpected interruption to the proceedings. One reporter mentioned that sources at the scene described what appeared to be a significant document exchange that caused visible distress among attendees. My phone buzzed with a text from David McKenna. "Saw the news. Are you okay?" I replied simply, "Yes. The right thing was done." Catherine tried calling again, and this time I answered. "Denise, what happened? The whole place went crazy after you left. Jason looked like he'd seen a ghost, and then investors started leaving in groups. Is everything okay?" "Everything is exactly as it should be," I told her. Jason finally got to see the real financial picture, instead of the fiction he'd been presenting. "What do you mean?" "Catherine," I said gently, "you'll probably want to start looking for another position. Viper Point is going to face some serious challenges in the coming weeks." There was silence on the other end as she processed what I was telling her. Catherine was smart enough to read between the lines. "Denise, what was in that folder?" "The truth," I said simply. "Just the truth." After hanging up, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. For months, I had watched Jason manipulate numbers, pressure staff, and build his success on a foundation of lies. Tonight, that foundation had crumbled in front of the very people he had been trying to impress. The applause that had greeted his declaration about cutting useless employees would be the last celebration he would enjoy at Viper Point Dynamics. Wednesday morning brought the first wave of consequences. I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The Portland Business Journal had somehow obtained details about the launch event and published an article titled, "Financial Questions Rock Viper Point Dynamics Following Executive Departure." While they were careful to avoid specific allegations, the implication was clear. Something significant had gone wrong. By 10 a.m., 3 major investors had formally requested emergency meetings with the board of directors. 2 others had sent letters indicating their intention to reevaluate their investment position, pending clarification of recent financial disclosures. The domino effect I had anticipated was beginning in earnest. Catherine called just before noon, her voice tight with anxiety. "Denise, the office is chaos. Jason called an all-hands meeting this morning, but he looked terrible. He kept saying everything was under control, but nobody believed him. Then David McKenna showed up with 2 other auditors, and they've been locked in the conference room with Jason and Robert Hayes for hours." "What about staff morale?" I asked, genuinely concerned for my former colleagues. "People are scared. There are rumors about layoffs, about the company being in financial trouble. Some people are saying you were right all along about Jason, that he was cooking the books." The validation felt hollow. Being proven right about Jason's corruption provided no joy when it meant potential hardship for innocent employees who had simply been trying to do their jobs. These were people I had worked alongside for years, professionals who deserved better than to have their careers disrupted by one man's greed and ambition. Thursday brought news that Jason had been placed on administrative leave pending a comprehensive audit. The announcement came through a terse press release that cited ongoing financial review processes and the need for complete transparency during the evaluation period. Reading between the lines, it was clear the board was positioning itself to cut ties with Jason entirely. Friday afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Marcus Wright, CEO of Bright Ridge Manufacturing, one of Viper Point's primary competitors. I had known Marcus professionally for several years through industry events, and I respected his reputation for ethical leadership. "Denise, I heard about the situation at Viper Point," he said without preamble. "I also heard that you were the one who exposed whatever was going on over there." Word travels fast in our industry. I replied carefully. It does when someone shows real courage. Listen, I know this probably isn't the best timing, but I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you. We're looking for someone to head our financial operations. Someone with unquestionable integrity and deep industry experience. The offer caught me off guard. In my focus on doing the right thing at Viperpoint, I hadn't given much thought to what would come next for my career. The idea of joining a competitor, especially one with Bright Ridge's stellar reputation, was intriguing. I appreciate the interest, Marcus, but I should probably let things settle down before making any major decisions. Of course. But Denise, what you did took real guts. The whole industry is talking about it. There are a lot of people who respect what you stood up for. After hanging up, I realized that my professional reputation, which I had worried might be damaged by the confrontation with Jason, was actually being enhanced. The industry was recognizing my actions not as corporate disloyalty, but as professional integrity. Other executives were seeing what happened at Viperpoint as a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical leadership. The following week would bring even more dramatic developments, but for now, I allowed myself to feel cautiously optimistic about both the immediate consequences of my actions and the longer-term possibilities for my career. The final blow came exactly 1 week after the launch event, delivered with the cold precision of a federal investigation. I was having coffee at my kitchen table when Catherine called with news that would end Jason's career permanently. "Denise, the FBI is here," she whispered into the phone. "They arrived about an hour ago with warrants. They're seizing computers, files, everything. Jason was arrested at his house this morning." The speed of the investigation surprised even me. Apparently, one of the investors who had left the launch event had contacts within the Securities and Exchange Commission. The folder I had handed Jason hadn't just exposed him to our board and investors. It had triggered a federal investigation into securities fraud. "What about the staff?" I asked, my concern for my former colleagues overriding any satisfaction I might have felt about Jason's arrest. "Most people are being sent home while they complete the seizure. Human Resources is telling everyone that the company will continue operating, but honestly, nobody knows what's going to happen." The afternoon news confirmed what Catherine had told me and more. Jason had been charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to manipulate financial records. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. Viperpoint stock, which had been trading at record highs just days earlier, had been suspended pending the investigation. By evening, the story had reached the national business news. CNBC ran a segment about corporate fraud in mid-sized manufacturing companies, using Viperpoint as a case study in how quickly fraudulent accounting practices could unravel. The reporter noted that the investigation had been triggered by whistleblower evidence provided by a former executive with intimate knowledge of the company's financial practices. Robert Hayes resigned from the board that same day, along with 2 other directors who had been instrumental in hiring Jason. The remaining board members appointed an interim CEO and announced their intention to cooperate fully with federal investigators. They also issued a public statement, acknowledging that serious financial irregularities had been discovered and promising full transparency throughout the investigation. The irony was not lost on me. Jason had branded me as a useless employee who held the company back. In reality, I had been the only thing standing between Viperpoint and complete destruction. My refusal to certify fraudulent financial statements hadn't just protected my own integrity, it had saved the company from even deeper legal troubles. 3 months later, I was sitting in the executive conference room at Bright Ridge Manufacturing, reviewing quarterly reports as their new chief financial officer. Marcus Wright had renewed his offer after the dust settled at Viperpoint, and I had accepted, drawn by his commitment to ethical leadership and transparent operations. The transition had been remarkably smooth. Bright Ridge's financial systems were exactly what I had hoped to find, meticulously maintained, fully compliant, and refreshingly straightforward. After years of fighting Jason's attempts to manipulate our numbers, working with clean books felt like a relief I hadn't realized I needed. Viperpoint had survived, though barely. The interim CEO had managed to steady the company, by implementing aggressive cost-cutting measures and completely overhauling their financial reporting systems. They had also hired McKenna and Associates to conduct a comprehensive audit and implement new oversight procedures. Catherine had stayed on as part of the skeleton crew, working to rebuild the company's reputation and operations. Jason's trial was scheduled for the following year, but his legal team had already indicated they were seeking a plea agreement. Industry analysts estimated that his fraud had cost investors over $12 million in inflated valuations and false projections. Several civil lawsuits had been filed by pension funds and individual investors who had made decisions based on the fraudulent financial statements. The case had become a talking point throughout our industry about the importance of financial oversight and the courage required to speak truth to power. I had been invited to speak at 3 conferences about corporate governance and ethical leadership, though I had declined all requests. I preferred to let my actions speak for themselves. As I reviewed Bright Ridge's impeccable financial records, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that night at the Everhart Hotel. Sometimes doing the right thing came with a cost, but sometimes it led to opportunities better than anything you had imagined. My phone buzzed with a text from David McKenna. Saw the Bright Ridge announcement. Congratulations on the new position. The industry is lucky to have someone with your integrity in a leadership role. Looking back on the path that had brought me here, I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that sometimes justice and professional success could align perfectly.